Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for coming out today. And I want to express my gratitude to the Santa Cruz Valley Historical Society for giving me this opportunity to share with you a wonderful and very poignant story from our military aviation history. So you may wonder, what was my motivation for putting together a WASP presentation? Whole thing started with a road trip in October of 2024. My wife and I drove over to Abilene, Texas to attend the last reunion of my first flying squadron in the Air Force, the good old 774th Tactical Airlift Squadron. And I should tell you at this point, for reasons that will become apparent momentarily, that from the time I was flying in the 774th up until today, I've been a Dedalian. Dedalians are a fraternal order of military pilots that's been around since 1934. And today there are 75 flights spread across the country. And I lead the old Pueblo Dedalian flight that's up in Phoenix, or up in Tucson. So on one day of this reunion, a number of us made the short trip from Abilene over to Sweetwater, Texas to visit the WASP Museum. And it didn't take me long in that place to realize what a remarkable story it was telling. And for years, I had had a special interest in that story because I wanted to know more about the two WASPs who had been members of my Dedalian flight in Tucson. Both of those ladies had flown west by the time I joined the flight, so I never got to know them. So this morning, I'm going to tell you the story of how the WASP organization came into being, and it was quite an evolution. Then I'll introduce you to my two WASPs, Eleanor Gunny Gunderson and Ruth Daly Helm. First, I need to acknowledge one of my key sources of research for this presentation, and that was the WASP Museum. The historian there, Ann Howe, was wonderful, a delight to work with, especially because she put up with me, because I always had one more question, or what about this? Can you send me something else? And she always came through. And during the presentation, I'll tell you a little bit about the WASP Museum. So come with me now to 1942. It's a time when the Army Air Corps was in urgent need of pilots for the two-front war that was underway. Early in that year, a very prominent female pilot of the day, Jackie Corcoran, went to see General Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces. And she pitched the notion of using women pilots to free up men for combat duty. And she said, we can do so much more than just ferry airplanes. We can test fly repaired airplanes, tow gunnery targets, and so much more. And General Arnold said, no, we're not doing that. So Jackie thought, okay. She rounded up 25 female flyers and took them to England, where they started ferrying airplanes for the Brits. And they were part of the Air Transport Auxiliary. They were affectionately known as the Attagirls. Meanwhile, back in the States, another well-known female pilot, Nancy Love, independent of anything Jackie was working on, went to see Colonel William Tunner. He was commander of the ferrying division. She pitched exactly the same idea. And Colonel Tunner was a little more supportive, so by June, she had produced a plan for putting women in military cockpits. In September, that plan landed on the desk of our old friend, Hap Arnold. And he thought, women pilots, what a great idea. So he said, Nancy, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to put you in charge of the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. Start recruiting pilots. She recruited 30 women. Of those, 28 made it all the way through training, and they became known as the originals. Now I want to take a minute and tell you about the very first recruit, Cornelia Ford. Because if you've ever seen the movie Tora, 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 you know part of her story. She was a flight instructor in Hawaii, and she was airborne with a student on December 7, 1941. Looking out of the cockpit of her airplane, she saw a military airplane, her altitude, coming hot and fast straight at her. So she grabbed the flight controls from her student, pulled up, rolled over, and boom, the airplane went flashing by. And that's when she saw the rising sun painted on the fuselage, and she knew that was trouble. So she turned for John Rogers Civilian Airport, and as she and her student were running for cover, the pursuing Zeros strafed their airplane on the ground. Very sadly, she was the first of these women to die. She was killed in a mid-air training collision in March of '43 in Houston. Back to Jackie Cochran. It's September, and she has just returned to the States from England the day before the announcement of the Women's Auxiliary Fairing Squadron. So the next day when that announcement dropped, she was hopping mad, and she went and confronted General Arnold with, "You liked her idea, but when I brought it to you months ago, you weren't having it? Really?" So General said, "Okay, Jackie, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to put you in charge of the Women's Flight Training Detachment." So peace was restored. In May of '43, Jackie moved all the training from Houston, where the flying conditions were way overcrowded. And remember, that's where Cornelia Ford was killed. She moved everything to Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. Then in August of '43, the Auxiliary Fairing Squadron and the Flight Training Detachment merged into one organization, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or the WASP. Jackie Cochran became head of the WASP. Nancy Love took over the Fairing Division. Before I discuss the WASP training program, I want to highlight for you how these women were treated differently than the men. Because they were in civil service positions, they had to pay their way to Sweetwater and back home again if they washed out. They paid $1.65 a day for room and board, and that was deducted from their monthly pay of $174.50. Even though they were civilians, they had to wear uniforms, conform to military regulations, and do the exact same training and work as the Army's male pilots. When a WASP was killed, in some cases there would be a memorial service, but in many instances the family would simply get a telegram along the lines of, "Your daughter was killed this morning, where do you want the body?" And if those families couldn't afford to bring their daughter home, the WASP would take up a collection to help with those expenses. As a final point on this, those families that lost a daughter were not permitted to display a gold star in their window, as was the case for a fallen male soldier. This unequal treatment would take a long, long time to correct, and I'll talk about that later. By the time training had moved from Houston to Avenger Field, the course had expanded from 23 to 30 weeks. The ground school was comprehensive. It included classes in meteorology, mechanics, map reading, navigation, parachute packing, and 50 hours in a link trainer. There was also physical conditioning. Flight training was divided into 3 phases and included time in 7 different aircraft. By the time a WASP graduated, she had accumulated 210 flight hours, and that's not bad. The WASP were only active for 2 years, but listen to what they got accomplished. They flew over 60 million miles in 75 different aircraft types. They were stationed at 120 bases across the country, and sure, they ferried airplanes, but they also took up meteorologists for weather observations, test flew repaired aircraft, transported equipment, flew as couriers, transported VIPs, and they towed targets to train gunnery crews on the ground. By 1944, General Arnold had come to fully appreciate the value of the WASP, and he testified before Congress that it's time to make these women part of the Army Air Corps. But complicating matters was a group of civilian male pilots who wanted the jobs the WASP were filling. So in the end, Congress did not make the WASP part of the military. And in October of 44, the WASP were notified that as of 20 December 1944, your services will no longer be required. The last class of WASP graduated just 13 days before they were disbanded. And at that graduation ceremony, General Arnold told the class that you and 900 of your sisters have proven that you can fly wingtip to wingtip with your brothers. They were discharged without benefits, and in the 4 to 6 months it took to train the male pilots, the delivery of aircraft was hampered. When the WASP were disbanded, their records were sealed, marked secret, and stored in the National Archives for over 30 years. For that reason, historians did not have access to the records or accomplishments of the WASP, so their story was systematically omitted from the official histories of World War II. In the early 70s, insult was added to injury when the service branches announced for the first time ever, women will be allowed to fly military aircraft. The surviving WASP were stunned to think that they had all but been forgotten. So in response, a grassroots campaign was organized that gained support from Hap Arnold's son and Senator Barry Goldwater. In 1977, a GI Improvement Act was passed that declared, among other things, that the WASP had served on active duty and they were finally given the same benefits as other veterans. In 2010, Congress awarded the WASP the Congressional Gold Medal. At the time, less than 300 of them remained. An important element in restoring the WASP to their rightful place in history was the move to establish a National WASP Museum. That effort got underway in 2002 with the vision of two women, WASP Deanie Parrish and her daughter Nancy. The museum opened on 28 May 2005, which was the 62nd anniversary of the first class to graduate from Avenger Field. Today, the mission of the museum is to honor the legacy of the WASP, which they do very well, and to inspire current and future generations. So now I want to personalize the story by telling you about my two WASPs. First up is Eleanor Gunny Gunderson. One of the most important influences on her character development was her father, Henry. He rode with General Pershing, chasing Pancho Villa into Mexico, and during World War I, he served in France as a bugler and radio operator. After the war, and for the rest of his extremely long life, he lived to 103, he was very active in veterans groups. So I think it'd be safe to say that his commitment to service rubbed off on his daughter. And Eleanor was born in 1922 in Iowa. After she graduated from Roosevelt High School, she attended Iowa State College, and that's where she learned to fly. And she logged time with the Civil Air Patrol. In October of '43, she was invited to interview for a WASP training slot, which she got and she graduated in September of 44, just 3 months before the WASP were disbanded. During that short time, she served at Minter Army Airfield in Bakersfield, California. In later years, she became an active spokeswoman for the WASP. Gunny passed in 2013, and her ashes were taken to Sweetwater for a memorial service. In attendance were 14 WASP and Eleanor's son, Dave Amory. At the memorial service, her ashes and those of fellow WASP, Betty Jo Reed, were spread across the runway at Avenger Field. While I was at the WASP Museum, I held hands with Gunny Gunderson. Here's how that was possible. In the museum are 2 large displays of handprints made by some of the WASP putting their hands in wet cement. So when I saw Gunny's display, I put my hands in her prints just to say hello from the old Pueblo flight that she had been a member of. Now let's talk about Ruth Daly Helm. Born in December 1916 in Grapeland, Texas. One day when she was 11 years old, a barnstormer pilot had to make a forced landing in a field outside of town. So Ruth's father, Henry, who owned the Chevy dealership in town, took some tools out to the pilot to help make repairs. And the pilot said, "Look, I can't pay you for this kindness, but I'll give you a ride in my airplane." And Mrs. Daly said, "Henry, you are not getting in that airplane." So Henry said, "Ruth, you take the flight." She did, and a dream was born. In 1937, she graduated from Baylor University with a degree in business, went back to Grapeland to take over the family's auto dealership. And it was during this time that she learned to fly, earning her pilot's license in 1939. She became a practical and frugal young woman, telling friends, "I don't need nice new clothes because I'm saving my money for flying time." So by the time she entered WASP service in 1943, she had a good deal of life experience and 250 hours of flying time. During her WASP career, she flew with the 5th Ferry Group in Love Field in Dallas. There she flew 800 hours and 10 different aircraft types. One day, after dropping off an airplane in Buffalo, she got checked out in a P-39 by giving it a couple trips around the pattern, and that airplane had a red star painted on it like the one you see on the screen because it was headed for Russia. On another occasion, flying a P-40 into Newark, she had her one and only mishap. She touched down on a clear runway that had 3 feet of snow piled up on either side. 50 feet into that landing, she had hit a patch of clear ice. The airplane skidded into a snowbank, did a half turn, the gear collapsed. So now she's got to go before the Dallas Safety Board. And she said the only thing that saved her was that an hour earlier, a male pilot flying a P-51 into Newark had the same thing happen to him. In 1946, she bought an airplane and moved to Tucson. Once she got here, she and several fellow WASP opened the Thunderbird Fly-In Guest Ranch. And it was at the ranch that she met her future husband, Walter J. Slats Helm. And I think this was a case of opposites attract, because Slats was a cowboy who thought anything higher than a horse's neck was dangerous. They were married in 1951, and Ruth stopped flying in 53 when their daughter was 1 year old. After her flying days were over, she remained active, and I mean very active, in church and community groups. The list of things she was involved in is too long to discuss here, but of course it included the Tucson chapter of the WASP, in the Pima Air and Space Museum. In 1999, she was inducted into the Arizona Aviation Hall of Fame. Finally, having attended college during the Great Depression, she saw many students who would not have been there except for a scholarship. So years later, when she had the time and the means, she and a friend established the Institute for Better Education. In its first year, the Institute awarded $27,000 in scholarships to 55 needy students. The newspaper article that contained that information was from 2003. As of that year, the Institute had awarded $1.5 million in scholarships to over 1,400 students. So this was a woman of great consequence and great substance. She flew west on 28 Feb 2015 as it is interred with her husband at East Lawn Palm Cemetery in Tucson. During its short tenure, the WASP organization graduated 18 classes. They drew more than 25,000 applications. Of those, only 1,830 were accepted, and of that number, 1,102 actually finished the program. 38 WASPs were killed in training. Last year, when I gave this presentation to several groups, 4 WASPs remained. But today, there are only 2. When I was doing the research for this program, I fell in love with these women. I so admired their grit, and especially the courage they demonstrated to occupy a role that was way outside the traditional role of women in the 1940s. I think they're just wonderful, and now I hope you do too.
Gonna take a sentimental journey, gonna set my mind at ease. Gonna take a sentimental journey to review all memories. I got my bags, I got my reservation, spent each time I could afford. Like a child in wild anticipation, long to hear that all aboard. 7, that's the time we leave at 7. I'll be waiting up for heaven, counting every mile the railroad track that takes me back. Never thought my heart would be so yearning. Why did I decide to roam? I'm gonna take a sentimental journey home. Thought my heart would be so yearning. Why did